Thank you for joining us today. We'll just give a moment for everyone to sign on. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just giving a moment here for folks to get on. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're here today for CILA's training, a deep dive into current conditions in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras with the experts. My name is Laura Egan, and I'm a senior staff attorney at the Children's Immigration Law Academy, or CILA for short. We are a project of the American Bar Association. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you also to our guest speakers for being with us. We're very excited. We do have a few housekeeping items and reminders that I'd like to cover. This training is an hour and 45 minutes long. The last 10 minutes will be reserved for questions. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions that you have, so we can address those at the end. This training is being recorded, and CILA will post the training recording to our website a few weeks following the training. This course has been approved for 1.75 hours of CILA credit in the state of Texas. So we do have a survey at the end for feedback. We do appreciate getting feedback on our webinars, as well as a survey for CILA credit. So if you are in Texas, CILA will report your credit to the State Bar of Texas. If you're outside of Texas, please also complete that survey, because we will send a letter of attendance to you, and you can provide that to your State Bar to seek credit for attendance. Following the training, we will be providing a PDF of the PowerPoint slides that you'll see today. So take a look, keep a lookout for those in your email, but those will come following the training. So to give some more information about CILA, we are a project of the American Bar Association. We are a legal resource center, a capacity building organization. We do not serve clients directly, and we are a small team based in Houston, Texas. We believe that every child should have representation, and that's a big reason why we're doing this work and why we're involved. So as I mentioned, we're based in Houston, so we do have some services that are Texas specific, but we also have a national reach. In Texas, we provide technical assistance to attorneys and representatives with case-specific questions who are representing children and youth in immigration matters. We also offer 4 Texas-based working groups to offer a space for collaboration and for advocates to share. We also have a national working group for pro bono coordinators in this space. We provide trainings, we create written resources, and we host a platform featuring pro bono opportunities across the country in children's immigration cases. We also have resources related to pro bono specifically. And in times with increased presence at the border with children and youth, there have been emergency shelters that have opened, and CILA has also been there to help as needed in our capacity building function. So today's training will focus on the political and cultural context of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, including reasons for migration. There are many reasons we wanted to host this training today. One reason is that we know country conditions is a huge part of any asylum case. In terms of the evidence that you need to develop, as well as the legal arguments that you need to make. But even if asylum is not the particular relief your client is seeking, we think that this is really important information to have a good working relationship with your client, to be able to understand their story and their experience, to improve client communications. And in turn, we think that will help us be better advocates in their legal case and otherwise, to be more equipped to serve the clients well in this work. So again, there are many reasons that we wanted to host this training today, but those are a few. So I'm very happy to introduce our guest speakers for today's training. We have a dynamic panel to bring diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And we're really grateful that they're sharing their time and expertise with us today. We couldn't do this without you. So thank you. And our speakers today are presented on this slide, and I'll provide some information now in the order that they are presenting. So Dr. Michael Allison is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Scranton. His teaching and research interests concern the comparative study of Civil War and Civil War resolution, particularly as it relates to the transition of rebel groups to political parties in Central and South America. He served as a consultant on Freedom House's Freedom in the World reports for Central America between 2011 and 2016, and more recently has provided expert witness testimony for approximately 75 asylum cases from Guatemala and El Salvador. Austin Robles is the Assistant Director for Central America from the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA. Adriana Beltran from WOLA previously planned to join as a panelist, but due to unforeseen circumstances, she could not today. So we really are grateful for Austin's participation. At WOLA, Austin supports the program research, analysis, and advocacy efforts, including helping oversee the Central American Monitor. Prior to joining WOLA, he spent 6 years as part of the National Democratic Institute's Latin America and Caribbean team, working to improve democratic governance in the region. Dr. Soryapa Portilla Vieira is Associate Professor of Chicano Latino Transnational Studies at Pittsburgh College. Her research and teaching priorities include Central American history, migration to the US, gender and labor in Central America, LGBT Latino populations, and queer immigration in the Americas. She has recently written a new book, Roots of Resistance, a story of gender, race, and labor on the north coast of Honduras. Dr. Stephanie Canizales is Assistant Professor of Sociology, University, California at Merced. Her research focuses on the migration and integration experiences of unaccompanied, undocumented Latin American origin youth and young adults in the US. She writes about Central American and Mexican origin children and youth migration, labor, transnational lives, and well-being and their transition into adulthood. Ana Aniza Gru is a coordinator of youth and migration at the Colectivo Vida Digna. Colectivo Vida Digna is a Mayan organization in Western Guatemala dedicated to the affirmation of indigenous identities. It supports youth, women, and families to fulfill their potential and growth of their communities. There, Anna supervises international postgraduate interns, coordinates educational programs for young women affected by migration, and works with the families of young unaccompanied migrants returned to Guatemala. She's an educator, social worker, and traditional midwife. So as you can see, we have quite an exciting panel, and we just really are grateful again to them. For this training today, Dr. Allison will focus on El Salvador, Austin will provide information regarding Guatemala, Dr. Portillo Vieira will focus on Honduras, Dr. Canizales will discuss the impacts of the political and cultural context on the experience of youth once in the US, and Anna will cover challenges of reintegration of youth into their communities, and including more information regarding Indigenous peoples and the work of the organization. So I just touched on what we'll cover, and there is a lot to cover, so I'm gonna let you guys take it away. Dr. Allison will start, and thank you so very much. So I'll stop sharing my slides now.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for organizing this panel. There we go. El Salvador is a population of about 6.7 million people. It's one of the smaller countries in Central America, smaller in terms of population as well as geographically. Sometimes we often compare it to maybe the size of New Jersey or Massachusetts. The population and the small geographic size actually makes it one of the most densely populated countries in the hemisphere, which for many of you is, part of the asylum case where you talk about some of the difficulties with which people might have should they be deported to El Salvador, because it's such a small country. So I was going to talk for the next 15 minutes or so is looking at many of the reasons why people are leaving El Salvador, why they're forced to flee. Obviously, there are some reasons that attract people to come to the United States, but that shouldn't take away the causes that lead people to flee their homes or to flee their entire country. Right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more recent history, Cold War history in El Salvador, some of the economic conditions in the country, touch on climate effects, as well as the role of gangs and drug trafficking organizations with specific concern to how they might affect vulnerable groups in El Salvador. And at the end, I'll touch on some of the developments in the Salvadoran government and the state in these last few years. Okay. So in terms of the country's relatively recent history, during the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War played out pretty brutally in El Salvador. From 1979 to 1992, El Salvador was engulfed in a civil war that had resulted from several decades of repression, socioeconomic exclusion, and the collapse of really all legal alternatives to affect the political system nonviolently. Over the decade or so, roughly 80,000 people were killed, including about 7,000 disappeared. Approximately 750,000 Salvadorans were internally displaced, and another million went into exile, many to the United States, but also to Honduras, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Europe. Many of those who fled to the United States though, sought refugee protection when they were here. However, our government denied them because many of those individuals had been fleeing a military that was funded militarily and economically by the US government. So it was difficult for the United States to sort of recognize these individuals as having fled persecution when the people who they were fleeing were the ones that we were supporting. Subsequently, or really in the 1980s, many of these young people who had fled El Salvador got caught up in California's gang wars. They joined or created the MS-13, the 18th Street gangs. And then after the Civil War in El Salvador had ended in 1992, the United States deported many of these individuals back to El Salvador, a country that many of them barely knew because they had left when they were young children. But at the same time, the United States really exported some of our own country's gang culture and gang violence, which contributed to the explosion of gang violence in El Salvador. Right? So again, this is some of where the MS-13, the 18th Street gang violence comes from is U.S. gang members who were deported to El Salvador, and for reasons related to a weak state, the availability of weapons, the attractiveness of these people who had gone abroad and formed their own groups. The MS-13 and the 18th Street gangs really became brutal political actors in El Salvador, beginning in the late 1990s until today. In terms of the economic condition, I'll get back to them a little bit later. All right, in terms of the economic conditions, the Northern Triangle economies don't perform well enough to provide quality jobs for their citizens. According to the World Bank, the annual GDP growth has exceeded 3% only twice in the last 20 years. It's averaging about 2.3%. Pre-pandemic, the economy had grown 2.3% in 2019. Not enough to really absorb the young adult population in the country. However, even with this low rates of economic growth, the country did register a decrease in population, in poverty, and improvement in inequality in the last 10 years or so. It's estimated that really between about 2007 and 2017, the poverty rate had decreased from around 40% to 30%. But much of that improvement was driven, we believe, by remittances, money sent by Salvadorans living abroad, primarily in the United States, back to family in their origin countries. And these remittances would make up over 20% of El Salvador's GDP. However, the COVID-19 pandemic had a significantly negative impact on El Salvador. Even with government support and government funding, the World Bank estimated that the economy shrunk about 8% last year. And the economy would have done much worse had it not been for record levels of remittances sent home from abroad. In 2020, Salvadorans sent almost $6 billion back to the country, 23% of its GDP. Another reason why people are leaving is climate-induced difficulties. Central America, including El Salvador, is one of the world's regions most at risk for climate change. El Salvador is part of the dry corridor. It covers about 3/5 of the country's territory. Communities in the dry corridor experience acute droughts. They result in the loss of crops and adding to food insecurity in the country. Over half of El Salvador's population, rural population, survives through cultivation and the sale of grains. And so they're seriously affected by unstable temperature changes, right? And unstable or unpredictable rains. And the dry corridor, it helped contribute to the push outwards from El Salvador of the country's people, really beginning in 2014 and continuing to this day. We know Central America and El Salvador is particularly vulnerable to storms, right? Hurricanes, more tropical depressions in El Salvador. In May and June 2020, Tropical Storm Amanda caused significant damage to the country's coastal cities. Approximately 25% of the annual rainfall totals for the year actually fell in just 70 hours. The storm killed 30 people and thousands of people lost their homes. Amanda was actually considered the worst weather disaster to affect El Salvador since 1998's Hurricane Mitch. And the country is vulnerable to earthquakes. Most of us, who are doing this work, I guess, know more about the 2001 earthquakes in El Salvador. That precipitated the United States granting temporary protected status to Salvadorans 20 years ago. And about 252,000 Salvadorans still have TPS. So obviously, all these are push factors with regards to immigration. But the one that draws the most attention really is connected to violent crime. El Salvador had historically high crime rates. Crime is driven by much of it's driven by the MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, but also drug cartels, organized crime, a corrupt police force, and often private citizens. The country's homicide levels peaked back in 2015 when it surpassed 100 for every 100,000 people in the country. And today the homicide rate's around 21 per 100,000, still double what the WHO considers an epidemic. However, I think the homicide statistics are incomplete because we don't have a lot of confidence in the validity and reliability of government data. Back in 2019, the president had announced that they wouldn't count individuals who had died in confrontations with police, nor those found dead and buried in graves that had taken place earlier in time, regardless of how earlier it was. The government walked that back, but they had already muddied the waters. The administration, President Bukele, has attacked news organizations that have questioned the violence in the country or tried to report accurately on violence. Other police have actually speculated that they believe some government authorities are not properly labeling murders as homicides, but instead other causes of death. And then finally, there seems to be, while the homicide numbers have decreased, disappearances have been increasing. So in 2020, the country reported about 2,300 disappearances, in addition to the 1,300 homicides. And then in between January and April this year, disappearances increased by over 100%. Right? So given all these factors of mixed messaging, a lack of trust in government statistics, and questions about the behavior of the gangs with regards to disappearances, others have, it gets a little difficult to try and explain what's causing this, what causes violence to remain at this level, right? So I think, one, you'll hear the government say that it's their territorial control plan that successfully reduced homicides. It was launched in 22 municipalities with high levels of violence. But for now, while national crime rates are down, scholars really haven't been able to demonstrate that homicides or violence in communities where the territorial control plan were implemented are any lower than other communities where the plan was not implemented. So it's a little bit questioning the causality there. There's a few other reasons, but I guess the main alternative is that it involves negotiations, government negotiations, perhaps with the country's main gangs. Like governments before them, the media reports that the Bukele administration negotiated with gangs in 2019 and 2020 in order to improve its performance in February 2021's legislative elections. The government offered various prison privileges, including food and visits and better prison facilities, in return for gang support for the incumbent party in the elections. And that involved mostly perhaps disappearing people, lowering levels of overt violence that could be seen, even though the violence itself is still there. More recently, there's some speculation that the gangs have stepped back in terms of their attacks against the state and their violence against each other, in return for the government not extraditing members of the MS-13 or gangs to the United States. So again, we don't entirely, there's still a lot of questions about what's bringing down this violence. And also it could just be related to 2020 being a pandemic year, which is rather a strange year for all of us. In terms of some of the vulnerable groups, El Salvador is a particularly dangerous country for women, children, members of the LGBTQ community, and for families. Strong patriarchal and machismo attitudes have contributed to an environment today where violence against women is normalized, condoned, and treated with impunity. El Salvador is one of the highest rates of femicide in Latin America and the world, and physical, sexual, and other forms of violence are pervasive as well. Although gang members are often the perpetrators, violence against girls is common and normalized within the broader society as well. So this could involve both other perpetrators in the home, or the lack of response from authorities, from the police, who see it much more of a domestic issue that they won't get as involved with. A report not too long ago found that domestic violence within the metropolitan area of San Salvador actually increased by about 20% during COVID, so last year. So that there's been an increase in the last year. In terms of children, children between the ages of perhaps 12 and 30 are the most vulnerable to gang recruitment efforts. Schools are often the site of violence. There's been hundreds of reports of hundreds of students who were killed, and teachers in the last few years. They either were members of gangs, they were being recruited into gangs, or they were being extorted. During the first 3 months of 2019, 25 students were murdered and another 21 disappeared. Violence against LGBTQ individuals continues. In 2019, Reuters reported that these individuals face persistent discrimination and abuse in El Salvador, where local gang violence and entrenched social prejudices can be a deadly mix. And that human rights organizations have found that police are often the perpetrators of violence against these individuals. And finally, we've also seen in the last few months families who have been forced from their homes in El Salvador to relocate internally or outside the country. They make up some of the 450,000 Salvadorans who are internally displaced. For example, earlier this year, 4 families in Sasuntabeque abandoned their homes because of gang threats. A young man had decided to leave the gang after they ordered him to kill his father. And then the gang threatened the man and his family and neighbors. And the police said, "We can't protect you forever, so it's better if you just leave." Right? So we're seeing examples of entire families and communities being forced to leave in El Salvador. You'll probably get almost a report a month in the Salvadoran news. Finally, in terms of the state, I think we're really concerned with the creeping authoritarianism in the country, the breakdown of democracy. Bukele was elected in 2019 at the head of a political party that was supposed to turn the page on the corruption and the incompetence, perhaps, of the previous administrations of the FMLN and the Arena Party. But Bukele has not sort of governed in a way that's really consistent with the rule of law or democracy. He barged into Congress in February 2020, surrounded by the police and the military, to try and force Congress to pass legislation that he wanted. Earlier this year, there was a couple of FMLN activists who were killed prior to the 2021 elections, which raised some concerns about the level of political violence in the country. In May, he removed members of the Constitutional Court and the prosecutor's office who were investigating corruption in his administration, which we see as a violation of the separation of powers, but probably unconstitutional, and just more focused on the authoritarian nature of the Bukele regime. We've also seen what looks like the politicized persecution of members of the previous administration because of the lack of due process in investigating charges against them. The lack of investigating corruption in his own administration, and attacks against the media who have questioned any of his behavior, the administration's performance. And then finally, the Salvadoran state, El Salvador is generally considered one of the more corrupt countries in the hemisphere, if not in the world. It scores a 36 out of 100 on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, where 100 is the least is no corruption. As a result, Salvadorans have very little faith in their political officials. The United States has stepped up its criticism of the regime in El Salvador for corruption and distributed the Engel list not that long ago, which identified individuals who are engaged in corruption or anti-democratic maneuvering. The police continued to either collaborate with organized crime, they work with gang members, or they utilize repressive tactics against gang members. There's been several examples of extrajudicial executions of gang members or suspected gang members in recent years. A couple of police in Usulatan and San Miguel were arrested not that long ago, believing that they had committed at least 48 homicides. Then in August of 2020, a few other officers were arrested belonging to a death squad as well. And the more recent concern is this fourth phase of Bukele's territorial plan involves increasing the army from 20 to 40,000, adding maybe a few thousand soldiers this year. For a country that had experienced a brutal 10-year war, where the military committed many of the human rights violations, and one of at least the big successes of the peace accords had been to remove the military from internal security operations. There's grave concern with Bukele's intention of increasing the military's role in policing in the country, thereby contributing to even greater violence and repression in the country. So the high levels of violence at the hands of the police and the military have led some Salvadorans to state that they fear the authorities more than they do the gangs. And at best, Salvadorans cannot count on the police to protect them, while at worst, they fear the police more than they do gang members and other criminals. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Austin, if you're ready to share your slides.
Hello, yes, one moment as I get this sorted. Okay, I'm hoping I'm doing this correctly. Great, well, thank you everyone for joining. So I'm going to talk about root causes of migration in Guatemala. And I think you'll see, as the countries all share very similar conditions and histories. A lot of the content from this presentation will also look pretty similar to Dr. Allison's as well. I've categorized my factors a little bit differently, but I'm going to talk about four criteria, and I've divided those into violence and insecurity, lack of social and economic opportunity, weak rule of law, and climate change. And within those, I have three cross-cutting factors which are present in every category as well. And one of those would be gender-based violence, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the legacy of the internal armed conflict, particularly indigenous discrimination and impunity for crime and corruption. So looking at any kind of review of data on Guatemala shows that the country faces endemic violence. So this is the rate of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, and you'll see that it's declined by about half since 2014, but it's still around 3 times the global average of 6.2. I also wanted to raise the point of Dr. Allison's the questioning the validity of government data. So this is provided by the Attorney General's office, but even the Forensic Institute within the country has higher levels of violence. So this is one of the more conservative estimates available. Femicide rates in the country are also about 1.8 per 100,000 women. So this is less than Honduras or El Salvador, but still some of the highest within the region. And these statistics also discount many cases due to legal definitions of what constitutes femicide within the countries, in addition to the points that Dr. Allison raised. Gender-based violence and intimate partner violence are also rampant, with the UN estimating that some 20% of Guatemalan women and girls between 15 and 49 have experienced violence in a relationship. Looking at some of the root causes of this violence as well, a lot of this is attributed to gangs and organized crime. So in the early 2000s, Central America became one of the main transit routes for illicit drugs and other illegal goods coming from South to North America. And as previously highlighted, gangs were exported from the States into these countries. It's hard to know the precise number of gang members, but some of the most conservative numbers, again from the UN, indicate that there are about 22,000 in Guatemala. A survey by Youth Power looking at former gang members indicated the profile of an average member joined around age 13 and remained in the gang for about 8 years. Most reported coming from families in which abuse was rampant or where parents or guardians either neglected or were unable to supervise them. They also reported that they joined out of a sense of belonging, protection, and friendship, and respect that no other community institution was able to provide to youth in these communities. So in many communities, men, women, girls, and boys are constantly being exposed to organized crime and gang violence. A Vanderbilt study or survey over the past decade, showed that about 20% of Guatemalans reported being the victims of some form of crime. The same study and other studies have shown that being the victim of a crime is one of the most powerful motivators, if not the most powerful, for migrants to leave Central America. And even a stronger factor there is whether the person had been re-victimized or been the victim of crime multiple times. So individuals really just reach a point where the dangers of staying in the country outweigh the risks of leaving the country and making the journey north. And extortion is gangs' economic engine and makes up the largest share of their income. So they primarily target small businesses, public transport operations, and residents of marginalized neighborhoods that they control. And that ties into my next point, looking at lack of economic opportunity. So the daily minimum wage in the country, according to the census information, is about $11 US. And most households are single income. That means that some 60% of the population lives below the poverty rate of $2 per day. And that has a devastating impact on health and nutrition, particularly for children. Some 46% of children under 5 experience stunted growth due to poverty and malnutrition. Looking at education, Guatemala provides free and obligatory education through 6th grade, which generally means between the ages of 7 and 15. And the UN estimates that a mean average years of 6.5 years of schooling per child. However, although education may be free, you still have to pay for uniforms, books, supplies, and transportation. So there are still some barriers to participating in or to receiving an education. And those barriers are much higher for Indigenous children and or people who are living in rural areas who can't afford or don't have the time to make the journey to a school, or schools are just not available in those areas. And for Indigenous people in particular, there are more than 20 different Mayan dialects. And so education is often not offered in their languages. And as I mentioned, there's also pressure to support the household through work. So they often are unable to continue education or drop out. Opportunities for formal employment and income are also scarce in general, and for women and girls particularly are troubling. Marriage at an early age is fairly common, and household maintenance and raising children are a full-time job. So as of 15, the minimum age of marriage became 18. Prior to 2015, it was 14 for girls and 16 for boys. However, exemptions are still possible to marry earlier than that. And the practice of child marriage is still common, particularly in Indigenous communities where it's been tradition and in rural areas where the government is not present. A UNDP survey showed that some 30% of women respondents were married by the age of 18. I don't think I have much to add to Dr. Allison's overview of climate change. The region is highly susceptible to natural disasters, namely earthquakes, tropical storms, hurricanes, flooding, and mudslides. Some 30% of migrants cited extreme weather as a reason for leaving, according to the World Food Program. And that number is likely to just continue to, the conditions are likely to continue to worsen as climate change worsens. And I imagine they'll continue to be a huge issue. But the natural disasters deal a tremendous amount of damage annually and displace millions of people internally or internationally. And also mean that millions of subsistence farmers lose their crops and face the food insecurity crisis. Oftentimes, families or communities will try to survive short-term by selling farming equipment that they need for long-term. So they essentially jeopardize their long-term security just to get through these kinds of disasters, which is unsustainable. I'll move on since anything else would just be a repetition of what's already been covered. But to look at COVID, the pandemic is estimated to have lost decades of social and economic growth in the region. And Guatemala is looking at vaccination rates among the worst in the Central or South American continents. In terms of full vaccinations, Guatemala has only 2.1%, which is the worst in the region. 11% are partly vaccinated, so Guatemala comes in at about third place, with just Nicaragua and Venezuela behind it in terms of receiving any dosages. And obviously the pandemic has affected all of us because we're also doing this via Zoom. However, the effects have been particularly awful in countries that have less resources or weak government capacity or higher levels of corruption. The use of emergency spending has allowed for opaque use of funds with little reporting. Emergency powers and executive decrees have allowed for curfews, arbitrary detentions, and abuse of power. And these kinds of mechanisms have very little room for accountability or oversight from watchdogs or NGOs. And that brings me to the last point I want to cover, which is looking at corruption and the weak rule of law. So tackling corruption and impunity are central, addressing to all of the challenges that I've raised, but the government is unwilling or unable to improve the situation. I think in general, poor governance can be a consequence of a lack of resources, a lack of capacity. But in the case of Guatemala and the Northern Triangle more broadly, I think poor governance is to a large extent a byproduct of grand corruption. There's a small group of political and economic elites who have increasingly colluded with organized crime to take hold of all branches of government. They use the government for their own self-interest and ensure impunity for themselves and their allies. The political electoral systems are pretty tightly controlled and must be reformed from within. However, the courts have been co-opted and can block aspiring candidates for a host of frivolous reasons. So at best, outsiders and anti-corruption candidates are blocked from running or exiled, in worst cases, threatened or killed. Few political parties really have ideological underpinnings or internal nominating systems, and they serve more as a vehicle for appointment to office, and appointments just come from party chairs or financiers. So this really translates to the economic and political elites lining their pockets and maintaining privilege. And they're largely uninterested in investing in social programs, democratic reforms, or responding to humanitarian disasters. Looking at the same Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Guatemala ranks 149 out of 180 countries surveyed in 2020, and ranked only 25 out of 100. Its scores have gone down over the past 7 years, and I imagine will continue to worsen as more anti-corruption officials have been pushed out in recent years and weeks. So I think this shows the corresponds to like the grand corruption really depletes public trust in institutions, but additionally it deteriorates the hope that life in the country can get better. And I think the systemic corruption and indifference has sown a lot of desperation and a deep sense of pessimism that life will not get better in the countries. So I think improvements in this area will influence the level of success in improving economic and social conditions and reducing violence, for my other points. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from Dr. Portillo Vieira. So you can share your screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen right now. I'm just going to do the basic stuff. Okay, everybody can see that, right? And you can hear me, hopefully. Well, you know, what a great opportunity to talk to attorneys. I've served as an expert since 2008 in various, I don't know, maybe over 100 cases by now, both affidavits and also in testimony live in the court. So I'm pretty aware of what's going on your end there and keep track of everything. I want to just give a few things. I want to let you know a little bit about my work. I'm an oral historian. I'm a historian. So that means that I use this feminist practice of oral history. I'm usually a participant observer. As you can see, many of these images have been taken by me. I look at history and how it influences the present. Many times people think, oh, historians do stuff in the past, how boring, right? But reality, what we're looking at is the present and how that is informed by the past. When I go on the record, for me, it's critical that we have a context and history, because Central America oftentimes is misread by even well-meaning Americans, as you can imagine, right? So, so I want to talk to you today, and I'm not going to have time to go through the entire PowerPoint, but I've provided the entire PowerPoint to CILA so that you can have access to some of the information that I'll be sharing today, and reach out to me if you have any questions. So I want to talk about the antecedents to forced displacement. Notice I don't call it migration, I call it displacement. I want to talk about misogyny and the heteropatriarchal state. And obviously as a feminist oral historian, I can't let that go. I'm going to talk about the failure of neoliberal policies and then what people do in resistance across borders. And I hope that that will be sort of a positive note to end in. I'm going to rush through some slides again because I want to make sure that I get to everything I want to do. This is just a map I took from the internet. Obviously, this is a map of Central America. Obviously, Fox News doesn't know what Central America looks like or where it is. So I now have incorporated a map in all my presentations for that reason. I also want to say one thing. The concept of Northern Triangle is a military concept. I try to not use it in my talks and my presentations for that region. And that is sort of a geopolitical determination by Southern Command and the military, which invaded Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and also Honduras in the 1970s and 80s. So I just want to caution that, right, for the historical record, because when we're arguing these cases in immigration courts, we are creating historical documents, and those are things that are quite problematic sometimes, right? So I want to come back to this concept of displacement, but I'm going to move forward here. Where Central Americans live in the US, these are social networks that were formed over time from the 1980s to now. There's San Francisco, New York, you know, Texas is a big place. New Orleans is a historic location. New York are historic networks of Hondurans that were displaced during Hurricane Katrina as well. I'm going to get and talk about antecedents and forced displacement in Honduras. And I want to talk about displacement because it's a really important, people don't want to leave if it wasn't for many of the reasons that everyone has talked about. So for example, the UNHCR has documented that in Honduras, they've helped 170,000 people already in 54 communities. 580,000 people are displaced within Central America. 113,000 of them are seeking asylum in Mexico, and internal displacement between Honduras and El Salvador is about 318,000. So that's something we need to think about. This is not migration. People are being displaced. They're being displaced by climate change, but oftentimes we think of climate change as big disasters, right? Like, you know, Iota, Eta, Mitch, yes, that's climate change. But I want to talk to you about capitalism and how US capitalism and the US sort of business interests have also created displacement in a place like Honduras. And actually what I wrote my book about, which is the United Fruit Company. Oops, sorry about that. I don't know why that happened. The United Fruit Company. But the interest that the US has had in Honduras and in Central America goes back to the 1850s. Central America is celebrating 200 years from independence from Spain this September. And actually that independence, we went right into, and I'm a Honduran, so I speak about being we sometimes, sorry about that. In that independence became a dependence into US capitalist interest. So you can see here the biggest interest being the United Fruit Company, which was there from 1912 until the 1990s. They left with Hurricane Mitch and left the country in shambles, the Standard Fruit Company. But then now we see post the 1980s wars, a transition into maquiladoras and export economy, another form of export economy and sort of flexibilization of the labor force. Mining projects, and then the recent thing in Honduras is the zonas de empleo y desarrollo, which are basically charter cities or private cities, a concept that was really developed in the United States, of course, in Silicon Valley, okay, and we can talk more about that. And they are actually threatening Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people. So if you're seeing more Indigenous people, you're seeing more Afro-descendants, you're seeing more LGBT people, these are some of the reasons why. These are the US military interventions. So there's something in the early 20th century that we call dollar diplomacy, and that was the United States put their military power to protect US interests. And that included the 1980s wars, right? The Contra-Revolucionarios, the counter-revolutionaries who were funded by Reagan in Honduras to oppress and hunt and kill Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Nicaraguans who had revolutionary wars. But I'm going to talk a lot about today, because I only have like 20 minutes, and I tend to go on long, about the coup, the 2009 coup, which was executed in Honduras on a Democratic elected president led by the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton. So again, the first migrations, if you will, are from the countryside into the maquila, right? So migration doesn't just happen overnight, right? We are seeing a crisis now in the world, not just Central America, right? I would like to point out sort of migration into Europe from, you know, southern countries and Africa, as well as Asia, and then here. So, but the first transition. So this is neoliberalism, right? These are the companies that are sewing the clothes that we're wearing on our backs right now, the back to school clothes. 2009, President Barack Obama and the then Secretary Hillary Clinton executed a coup in Honduras. And I'm going to give you some ideas of, I'm just going to show some crazy images that you can find on the internet as well. But with the coup is critical because it comes during what is known as a pink tide moment in Latin America, where you had leftist governments kind of winning at the electoral vote. Nobody was, in this period, there were no revolutions in the streets, but people were winning at the ballot box because the neoliberal policies were not working. This was obviously violent. Why do I show this images? Because the Obama administration and WikiLeaks in 2011 kept talking about a diplomatic coup. First, they didn't acknowledge it was a coup. They called it a transition of government. And then in 2011, they called it a sort of political diplomatic coup. And I don't know if that looks political diplomatic to you, but it's quite violent. These images brought back these sort of 1980s disappearances and military, takeovers, right? People were being killed. Vicky Hernandez, a trans woman, was killed during curfew. She was the first person killed during the coup, right? So transgender woman, again, a victim of the state. Civil and political rights violations. There were about 4,000 civil and political rights violations during the period. And then the institution of sort of a security state, right? Police and in the military. Also, coups are expensive, right? A lot of money is, look at all this gear, right? That these coup governments are buying, they're buying from other sort of military violent governments like Mexico or Colombia, right? This gear is very expensive, so it really depletes the coffers of government. Again, you see here all kinds of police, right? You see military on the right side, you see police on the left. And the military police, I keep saying that is because in 2014, when Juan Orlando Hernandez was elected, that's when they brought back the military police, which was a suggestion from the US Embassy, words out on the street about this, right? But now the US saying, oh, the military police is violent, right? So the US kind of plays both sides of the story in Honduras, and that's really important. This is like what a community looks like. This is right outside the Brazilian embassy where the president had come back into the country. He was ousted, sent to Costa Rica, came into the country and took refuge in the Brazilian embassy. These are images that were sent to me during the coup from Feminists in Resistance, which is a group of women and organizations that were protesting. And what they wanted to say is this is the kind of violence that was used against women in the protests, right? Women were raped during protests or when they were leading protests, right? So this is a military coup, a very violent military coup. And so it's really important to reflect that. And I always do that. But I also want to say that there was really great protests that happened during the coup, like this Afro-descendant organization. And everybody took to the streets from June 28th to January 1st, when the US forced elections in Honduras, right? And since then, there have been failed elections in 2013 and 2017. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. These are images. My students and I have been observers in these elections. So this is San Pedro Sula. You can't see my students there, but we're basically trying to serve as international observers to see corruption. Well, in this period, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's someone that's going to come up a lot in many of your reports, right? The so-called president re-elected himself in 2017, which is illegal in Central American nations because of the peace accords, right? You can't, this is to prevent military dictatorships and dictators in general. He re-elected himself. If you remember, during the 2009 coup, Mel Zelaya was accused of being a leftist and wanting to stay in power, aka such like Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro. And so he was ousted because he wanted to stay in power. But this guy decided that he wants to stay in power, and he basically illegally ran for office again. He didn't win. And I was an observer during this period, and we were tracking 13 voting centers. In San Pedro Sula, he did not win. But there was a blackout for 5 days after the elections, and all of a sudden he won. And he won, in dubious ways. I want to talk to you about two groups in Honduras that I think don't get enough attention, and I feel that are critical, and you are seeing more of these people in the courtrooms, right? One is the Garifuna community. The Garifuna community is Afro-descendant and indigenous, right? The UN has sort of acknowledged both the Garifuna community as Afro-descendant and indigenous, as well as people from the Chocó, Colombia, right? So it's two Afro-descendant groups. And they live between Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize, but the largest community is really in Honduras. And this is one of the historians from Belize who says they were never enslaved. And so this is a pride thing in the Garifuna community, right? They were maroon communities from the Caribbean. This is important to Garifuna identity, right? They arrived from St. Vincent where they fought the British and, from colonization into Honduras, right? So there's a spirit of resistance already from their migration and their displacement from St. Vincent. First, obviously their displacement from Africa and the regions in Africa, St. Vincent, and then come to Honduras. These are some figures that really need to be updated now. Sarah England wrote a great book about migration, Garifuna migration to New York, if you want to look into that. But one of the things I want to alert to you is, the undercount, right? The census tends to undercount Afro-descendants, undocumented people, undocumented youth, LGBT people. So always keep in mind that when you get a figure, the figure could be possibly 3 to 4 times larger, right? The most important thing to remember and why people are being displaced is because of capitalist investment, as well as climate change. So to me, climate change is linked to this capitalist investment situation because they live in the most beautiful areas in Honduras. They live in the pristine Caribbean lowlands, right, where people go to vacation, right? And the country is selling this land for private investment, tourism, ecotourism, and displacing people. There is the ILO Convention 169, which actually is right to prior consultation. So they are not supposed to sell the land without consulting indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people, but this is often not respected. Last July 2020, 5 people who were fighting this privatization of their land and the selling of their land to sedes or private charter cities were kidnapped by police. We say kidnapped because we never saw them again. They were never seen again. As a result, this movement gets started from Garifuna, who have communities in New York and Europe, as well as US South and in Central America to find what happened to them. So the Garifuna community has lost and have had disappearances more than any other community. Juan Orlando Hernandez's brother, again, why is this community so affected? Narco trafficking, right? When the United States pushed narco trafficking in the 80s, right? The DEA campaign under Reagan away from the Caribbean, where was it going to go? Are Americans going to stop using cocaine? I mean, is this right? So it went inland into Central America. And that's why we're seeing this narco corridor in Central America. Most scholars don't like to talk about it, especially if you go back to Honduras, because this is complicated, right? You can get killed, seriously. And is it the state? Is it the narco traffickers? Or in this case, is the state narco trafficker? Like the brother of the president of Honduras was just convicted of, being narco trafficker by a court in New York. So just to cap this, right? Deportations of youth in the 90s rise because the deportations of youth in Los Angeles to Honduras, right, create a rise in local gangs. But there's also these mano dura policies during President Maduro's terms in the 90s, which really reflect Rudy Giuliani's sort of, Rudy Giuliani's efforts in New York were sort of transpassed into Central America, right? Femicides increase, trans femicides increase. And I'm going to rush through because I don't know how much time I have, Laura, because I really want to get to this section. Feel free to just yell it out because I can't see it. I'm sorry. So I want to talk about misogyny in heteropatriarchal state. And Laura, do I have?
So you have about 2 minutes or so.
Okay, let me get through this. This is good. So everybody saw this cover, right, in Honduras, right? And I often do this training in Spanish or in English. So, you'll see some Spanish there. Just enjoy, practice. So this image was a Pulitzer Prize winner, great image of someone at the border. This is actually, I was in Honduras when the first caravan left. And I was doing a Fulbright there to look at queer migration and sort of country conditions. And this is what was on the press after that image came out. This is what the image actually is. And you can sort of see the Washington Post covered it. Now, why would they cover, right? If you see here in this image, right, the mother is totally erased, right? in a place where women, like 700 women are killed a year, right? Why would the mother be erased? And so this is an image, and again, this is an old map, but just to make my point, this is the areas where you can see the black points are where you can see the femicide rates are really high. And this is something that Mother Jones put together about where immigrants are coming from. I don't know where they got their data, I guess. If you put these two maps together, you will see, you know, this is where people are coming from. So this extreme violence, right, is these are also the areas in the north coast of Honduras where you see the big blue maps. That area is also where the United Fruit Company and the Standard Fruit Company operated. So those were the big places where people used to migrate to work. And when those places leave after Hurricane Mitch, right, they left a great void and great void there. Honduras is anti-marriage and anti-social reproductive rights. After the win in Argentina in January 2021, the Congress quickly went and passed this law without proper process, right, to basically say that it's illegal in the Constitution of Honduras to get an abortion, to have any education around abortion, and to get married as LGBT people. So I know we don't have a lot. I just want to kind of show some images of, you know, of transgender communities during Pride. I also want to show you the level of policing. Like, can you imagine going to Pride and seeing a guy with, like, I don't know what, is that an AK? I don't even know what kind of gun it is, but it's a huge gun. You know, so those are the kind of daily lives during the military dictatorship. I want to talk about this archive, especially. This is the Red Lesbica Catrachas archive. You can just Google Catrachas with a double T. They are the organization that have been keeping track of all the murders. They have this repository of information that was able to allow, right? So things like this, like in 10 years of the coup, more people have died, more LGBT folks, transgender and gay men have died in Honduras than in the last 20 years before the coup. I'm going to skip through the caravan stuff, and, you know, more people are deported from Mexico, and this other stuff, because I want to talk about and end with how people are fighting back, right? And one of those, Red Lesbica Catrachas, was able to put together enough evidence on the murder of Vicky Hernandez, the trans woman who I told you died, the first woman who died during the coup, and take this to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Now, to put together a case like that for a country like Honduras is nearly impossible during complete war. Low intensity warfare there, but they did it. The case was submitted in 2012, and on June 28th, 12 years after, you know, her death and the coup, and also the International Day of LGBT folks, right, like Pride Day in the world. The court found that the Honduran state is responsible for her death, not only responsible for her death, but did not investigate her death. Like, this is not even a nonprofit group. This is a collective of lesbians and trans men who put together this case that was now not only fundamental for trans people in Honduras, but in all of Latin America. Basically, what they found is that the Convention for Belém do Pará, right, which Americans don't tend to use very much, basically was violated by Honduras, so that a trans woman should have been protected as a woman by the Convention of Belém do Pará. So this is really historic and important to remember about the ways that people resist, as well as you can see here transgender people during the death of when Roxana Hernandez was killed. Roxana Hernandez was killed in ICE detention in 2018. Trans people came out, including Honduran trans folks. We got people there to New Mexico to process her death. So a few conclusions to wrap this up, and I'm sorry if I'm going a minute or so over. Understanding the history of U.S. empire is critical to understanding the invisibility of Central Americans, especially Hondurans in the U.S. It's important to the U.S. State Department and to the U.S. to not see Central America. We are their backyard. This is where they do their bad, dirty business. Reagan was a bad man. Bush was a bad man, right? They committed crimes against humanity in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and Nicaragua. And in Honduras, they house that military. And then also, I want you to consider migration as displacement. And again, it's so important to nurture those organizations on the ground doing work. And you can contact me here. And, if you feel free to look at my book. It's about history of all kinds of stuff. Take a look. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. And next we'll hear from Dr. Canizales. So you can share your screen.
Hi, everyone. It's all fun and games until you have to unmute, turn your camera on, and share your screen at the same time. I lost my screen share window. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Great. I am so excited that I don't have to do all of that explanation backstory in this presentation and that it's already been taken care of. My name is Stephanie Canizales, and what I hope to move us to in the discussion on unaccompanied youth integration in the US is a recognition that the context of exit, right, that the socio-political and socioeconomic and even environmental forces that are displacing people also have socio-emotional or emotional and mental health underpinnings, and that because of that emotional displacement, along with the socio-political, socioeconomic, that means that their incorporation in the US will also have to include an emotional and mental health component. So my name again is Stephanie Canizales. I am a professor of sociology at UC Merced, and I have over the past, can you all see my cat? That's kind of embarrassing. I have over the past 12 years been studying the integration of unaccompanied youth in the US. So we have over this time kept a vigilant eye on the number of unaccompanied minors being apprehended at the border and the causes of their migration. Every spring and summer since 2014, we've heard of the unprecedented surge of unaccompanied children at the border, which scholars have recently started to point out couldn't possibly be unprecedented if it happened every year, right? So just as Suyapa was mentioning the importance of language and what we named things, I think moving away from calling this migration trend or displacement trend unprecedented is also really important, and recognizing that the causes of displacement have been longstanding and will continue to hold until we hold people to account for the reasons why children specifically, are actually leaving their home countries. So just as children are arriving at the border and being apprehended at the border at high rates, children are also being resettled in the US at higher rates than before. I left out 2020, the 2019 to 2020 year because of the pandemic. Title 42 and the Trump administration's limitations on entry and resettlement make it so that the year looks like there were very low numbers of children, which doesn't reflect their migration and arrival at the border. So I just want to draw attention to the fact that first, that Florida and California, in the 2 years that I bring up here, switched positions, and Florida is now receiving more children than the state of California, which was surprising to me. But that Texas has consistently, since I've been studying this population since 2009 actually, that Texas has been one of the highest states receiving the highest number of unaccompanied children, which is really relevant to a lot of the audience here today. So some very important and groundbreaking research has been published that describes unaccompanied Central American children's experiences in incorporation, specifically their experiences as migrants, as legal subjects, and as deportees, and then return migrants to the US. So I want to walk through what some of this research finds. First, Lauren Heidbrink's first book, a 2014 publication, draws on research with children and their families, attorneys, social workers, law enforcement, and other actors to center children's voices in the ways that they navigate their being framed as victims by humanitarian organizers and delinquents by law enforcement throughout their migration process. Children in this book are positioned as knowing migrant actors who agentically engage with and evade the state, right? So rather than being unknowing or dependent or helpless children, they're actually actively navigating how and when they will engage the state once they are apprehended and taken into US custody. In Susan Theriault's book, Whose Child Am I? It's one of the only books that has data conducted in detention facilities and shelters. She draws on interviews with hundreds of children, staff, and legal actors, again, in the detention center to answer the question posed in the title. Who do unaccompanied children belong to when they're in the custody of the state, or when they're migrating unaccompanied? So what she finds is very similar along the lines of what Heidbrink finds, that the US government's punitive stance against undocumented immigrants justifies the detention of unaccompanied children, but the reverence of childhood in Western societies puts children in often symbolically designed facilities that are intended to protect their health, protect their best interests. At the end of the day, these facilities are still what Philip Shrike calls in his book entitled Baby Jails, right? Even if they are following the Flores Settlement Agreement or TVPRA or any other policy intended to protect children, there's still detention facilities, prisons at the end of the day. And in her most recent book, Migranthood, Lauren Heidbrink takes up the case of Guatemalan Maya children who were deported and analyzes the power of state violence, poverty, debt, everything that was just talked about in the three previous presentations, the role of family, responsibility and obligation, and the role of US intervention in the region in inciting second, third, and later attempts at migration. She continues to press this idea that children are active agents in migration decisions, not only in where they go, but also when they go and whether they go again. So I want to focus on this idea of children as legal subjects, because that's a lot of what the audience here is engaged in, right? Along these lines, scholars have studied children moving through asylum processes or moving through federal facilities, and find that the burden of proof of persecution or the need for protection can narrowly reconfigure the lives of unaccompanied children who were once knowing actors, and in their reframing as victims or as dependents or as helpless and hopeless, legal advocates and actors can facilitate the construction of paper lives that don't adequately, no offense to anyone here, but don't adequately capture the complexity of children's migration decisions and the reasons for their displacement. Chiara Galli writes that this results in a rite of reverse passage, where the rite of passage is from childhood to adulthood, but in many of these cases, children are moving from adult roles in their home countries or feelings of agency through migration, and then being repositioned as helpless children, right? So rite of reverse passage there. Gali also writes that legal actors, in constructing these narratives, drawing on different experiences, very tactfully finding the protections that match the experience of the young person, that legal actors act as humanitarian capitalists, right? People who are cultivating humanitarian capital, resources that then grant humanitarian protection for children. So until now, much attention has again been given to youth being moving through formal resettlement channels and processes. Few studies have considered how youth come of age in a broader sense. And in a recently published policy report with my colleague, Dr. Daisy Diaz-Strong, a professor of social work at the University of Illinois at Chicago, we talk about the need to widen the frame, right? The need to include this perspective of youth as knowing migrants, children who are coming of age outside of these formal settlement channels, children who are migrating for work to support parents and siblings, and therefore not only in need of care, but as caregivers themselves, and also children who are minors who are already parents, right? And again, reinforcing this idea of caregiving. What we really point out in this report, available with the Immigration Initiative at Harvard, is that 83% of Central Americans who migrate as unaccompanied minors do so between the age of 13 and 17 years old. So unlike a lot of what we know about the dreamer narrative, where people maybe are unaware of their country of origin or have no real attachment to the home country, and therefore the US is their home and they're indistinguishable from their peers. The fact that these young people a majority of these young people are migrating in adolescence and later adolescence really tells us that they understand the reasons for their migration, that they understand the roles that they play in society, and they also have distinct expectations for adulthood and incorporation in the US or plans for return. Daisy Diaz-Strong, the co-author on that report, writes that this unique experience of remembering the home country and taking part in migration can contribute to a divergence in the transition into adulthood for unaccompanied minors. She identifies two groups of unaccompanied youth and 3 pathways of transition within those two groups. So she identifies the enrolled and the never enrolled youth. And I've done intake observations, and I've also done interpretation work and written my own expert witness or country condition reports. So I know there's sometimes confusion about children who don't really care about the legal process and want to go to work, or deprioritize the legal process. I shouldn't say don't care, but deprioritize that because of the urgency of work, right? So children are never enrolled. And what Dr. Diaz-Strong does in her work is say that there's actually gender differences and pressures on what adulthood would look like that are placed on children that then move them through different incorporation pathways as they transition into adulthood. The first pathway of the enrolled unaccompanied youth explains that children are able to secure this trajectory because they have at least one parent or one caregiver that grants financial stability enough to enroll children in school and foster their educational goals. That once in school, the challenges they face are a lot like what we know from the trajectory, the transition into adulthood of dreamers, right? A lot of what the literature, the research, the policies already tell us there. Never enrolled men end up in that position because they migrate to work to fulfill their gender norms, gender expectations of financial provision against the backdrop of poverty and lack of opportunities in the home country. Never enrolled men don't feel that their transition into adulthood is disrupted by legal status. I find in my research, a paper I'm working on now, that's actually unaccompanied status that these youth identify as the major block to their ability to transition into adulthood in the way they see other youth in their communities and in society at large transitioning into adulthood. But they don't feel that this block or that their transitions are disrupted by legal status because they don't experience inclusion in the way that other immigrant youth do, and then therefore never experience exclusion the way other immigrant youth do, right? The bad treatment at work, exploitation, poverty, all of these conditions are actually normalized as far as the home country, right? Never enrolled women are confined by gender norms and their constraints for educational pursuits. The expectation that women work as a form of care, especially providing unpaid care work in the home, is what confines them and restricts their educational trajectories, right? Gendered norms work to disrupt the desire to study, to explore, to be independent, and engage in supportive romantic relationships. In my research in Los Angeles, I focus on what Diaz-Strong refers to as never enrolled youth, just to kind of keep, I don't call them that, but just to kind of keep the linear line of thinking here. I find in my work that youth incorporation is characterized by what I refer to as work primacy. When they're not enrolled in school, school isn't the central organizing institution, it's the workplace, right? And work becomes the central organizing institution in their lives because of two pressures that they face and the fusion of these two. First, that youth have a need for unaccompanied youth, have a need to find means of survival, right, for themselves, but also the families that they left behind, families that they promised they would build a house for, start a business for, pay back debt, right? Also, the migration debt puts immediate urgency on finding work. The second pressure is that once they enter into the workforce or into US society, there's a high cost of living, especially in Los Angeles, where I do my research, but there's also low resources to meet the needs, all of the needs and the urgency that unaccompanied youth are facing, right? And again, because of exploitation, violence, and poverty, the primacy of work and the centrality of work in their lives is reinforced. So work becomes central to day-to-day survival, and youth come to make decisions around every other facet of their lives. I have a paper coming out on this. The decision to enroll in school, persistence in school, the decision to pursue medical health if they're facing illness or injury, transnational family participation, local community participation, all of these decisions about whether and to what extent these things can occur are fundamentally rooted in, again, what are their immediate needs And then what is the access to resources that they have to meet those needs, right? If there's some flexibility in some room, they might do those other things besides work. But if there's not, and there's too much work pressure, too many financial obligations, lack of resources, work is the central institution in their lives. And we can imagine, just as we know from adult undocumented workers, exposure to risks, health risks, physical health risks, mental health risks, poverty, long-term immobility, for these young people, delayed family formation, all of these different conditions they're facing in the workplace alongside adult migrants can seriously impact their developmental trajectories and also their life course trajectories and the types of mobilities they may face in adulthood, right? So people always ask me, well, who's helping them? Where do they turn to for support? I conducted 2 additional studies as part of my book project on the role of community organizations in supporting unaccompanied youth in Los Angeles. My first stop was co-ethnic churches, right? Churches are heralded as service hubs. Churches are really seen as the torch bearers for immigrant rights and humanity. But what I find is that unaccompanied youth do go to churches and find that prayer, reading the Bible, singing some songs really allows the space to spiritually find support, to cry out to God and to feel at peace, to feel free, and that helps them. But then it's also a place of retraso, of setback, where youth are told to give more, serve more, have more faith, volunteer more, to wait on God was something that came up often, the quote, wait on God, to change their circumstances. And if their circumstance didn't change, it's actually because they didn't believe or do enough. So again, it places the burden, the onus of the condition that unaccompanied youth are living back on the young person themselves, and that the lack of tangible forms of support, the lack of guidance about educational programs, here we go, the lack of guidance on educational programs, language learning, financial management, budgeting, family conflict resolution, all of that really results in retraso, right? I then observed the support group for 4 years, where I found that youth simply in having a space to talk about their everyday, every week experiences, got together once a week for 2 hours on Friday nights, and everyone answered the question, how was your week? Youth really started to vent, started to release the tensions, the conflicts, the challenges, the desperation they were feeling in terms of navigating the US sistema, right? The system is what they call it. El sistema aquí, it's so different from what we know in our home countries. So they were learning about sharing around work, their social lives, family lives, navigating challenges in their bodies or sexual desire and romantic relationships as well, right? We want to remember they're not just newcomers transitioning into a new society, they're adolescents transitioning into adulthood. So there's parallel processes happening here. Laura, I have my timer on, I'm almost done. So in just sharing youth experiences and commiserating with one another in the support group, what they were able to do is depersonalize their challenges, depersonalize a lot of the oppression, exploitation, even the isolation, loneliness, desperation they felt about not being able to figure out the sistema, right? They realized this is a community experience. It isn't me and it isn't my inadequacy. This is something that's happening to unaccompanied youth in this group, but also the larger Guatemalan, Salvadoran, Central American, undocumented immigrant community in Los Angeles. And there was something about this collective of young people simply sharing, not really offering solutions because they didn't have any, but simply acknowledging that they were sharing this experience that really allowed them to find the peace that they couldn't find elsewhere, right? And in that, we're actually learning coping mechanisms, coping strategies, resources for support that they were lacking from other places. So all of that in my book project, Sin Padres Ni Papeles, which I'm happy to say I am 4 out of 7 chapters done writing this book. I'm putting together all of this work, right? Recognizing that family separation, migration, resettlement are difficult, that traumas existed pre-migration, during migration, and in the resettlement process, that youth are navigating these challenges and these traumas individually, collectively, in a distinct way that recognizes their gender, right? I do research specifically with indigenous Guatemalan Mayan youth. So language and ethno-race, all of that has to do with the way that they're incorporating into US society. I also recognize that unaccompanied youth are set onto different incorporation pathways based on whether or not someone receives them, who receives them, and what resources they're offered by the person that receives them, right? That youth can end up in adult spaces like the workplace or navigating community organizations in a way that we often associate adults or sponsors or some kind of caregiver doing on behalf of children. And like the previous slide said, there was a quote there that the young person said, someone needs to tell us what's good or what's bad, right? So young people are really figuring this out. And in all of that, again, I'm attuned to the material condition as well as the emotional condition, the crying, the feeling of peace, the lack of peace, right? The hopelessness wrapped up in setback, the desperation of finding support, and the physical feeling of being an undocumented youth worker who's supporting and worrying about the transnational family. So in my book, I try to break down this socio-emotional incorporation pathway, right? Thinking beyond educational attainment, occupational attainment, and maybe home ownership and wealth accumulation, like a lot of the research does on immigrant incorporation, thinking about, well, if in all of the displacement that they were material displacement youth were experiencing that brought them here, there was also socio-emotional alienation. So in the process of material incorporation in the US, what does socio-emotional incorporation or belonging look like? So I will just let you know that there is a process of desahogando, of moving from an isolated state, like I mentioned, to a space where youth can vent and release a lot of the trauma that they're facing, to orientando, right? Finding out what's good or bad, what are they supposed to do, where are they supposed to go, finding value in their lives as humans, especially for indigenous youth, right? Feeling devalued or marginalized, and then finding, I'm not here by chance, right? I'm not on this earth by chance, as the quote in the middle says. And then adaptación, adaptando, adjusting to life in the US. And I saw this the most when youth said, you know, I was caught up and overwhelmed by my emotions. I didn't know where to go, but now when people come here, I tell them, hey, look, this is how we live. And post 2014, this became especially important for long settled unaccompanied youth to tell recently arrived unaccompanied youth, look, this is how this is how desahogo happens. This is how the releasing, the unburdening happens. This is what orientación looks like. This is what you need to do in the US. And now I'm adapted and I can be a community mentor for other young people. So all of that to say, I really hope that there is a acknowledgement of the diversity of unaccompanied youth, that there's a recognition that just as material, social, displacement occurs, there's also an emotional displacement process, and one that cumulatively builds across the migration and settlement process. And because of that, youth also require material, social, and emotional support in their incorporation, and that there is an ongoing cyclical process of desahogo, orientación, and adaptación that takes place as young people come of age, encounter new people, encounter new spaces, and then also interact with more newly arrived unaccompanied kids. So I will stop there. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter, Stephanie Canizales at UC Merced. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. We appreciate it. And next we'll turn it over to Anna and you can share your screen.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is Ana Cita Reve. I'm in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala right now. So if you hear a lot of dogs and cats, I apologize. So I'm here to talk today a little bit about the realities that Indigenous people face all over the continent. I'd like to have us reflect a little bit about the situation as it's been and how it is today. So to start out, I wanted to give voice to a situation that's been in the news lately, which is the American Indian boarding schools. These were established across North America in the 1860s, sorry. So what's not known about this is that in the period of 140 years, over 40,000 Indigenous children died during their time at these schools. These compulsory education institutions. The mission of these places was to kill the Indian to save the man. Just as Dr. Portillo so eloquently explained, sometimes we are thinking history is just history, it doesn't have anything to do with right now. As an Indigenous institution, Vida Digna, we beg to differ. We ask you to think about time and space as in movement, and to make sure that this unfortunate legacy of colonialism no longer dominates the present. I'm here today to have us reflect on the current situation of young Indigenous children, girls and boys caged at the border, dying in the desert, being killed by Border Patrol, forcibly separated from their parents and relatives. What we hope is that with the support of conscientious lawyers, social agencies in the US, this unfortunate legacy of colonialism with its ideological justification of taking the Indian out of the Indian will soon be part of the past and no longer dominating the present. Before I go on and I introduce our work, I wanted to show a couple images. This first one, as it says here, is of a North American boarding school, I believe in Canada. I found this image so striking and I wanted to share it with you. I see their faces so of the young women in this first row. You can see nobody is smiling, nobody's happy. It's as if they are saying, I've been forcibly taken from my parents. I also find it so ghostly, this faded quality in the numbers, and you can really reflect on what it meant to have so many schools, have so many unmarked graves that at this point in history, recently through a truth initiative by Deb Haaland, we're coming to see what happened. So for many years, we've known about the abuse, the psychological and the physical abuse in these spaces, but we didn't know about all the deaths. The relation for us is very clear, and I hope at some point for you as well. This next picture, as it says here, is of Claudia Gomez Gonzalez. She's a 19-year-old Indigenous Maya woman. She's from the town over from our work, San Juan Ostuncalco. She was killed by US Border Patrol agents in 2018. We thought it would be very important to show her here how she looked in her hometown. This is her clothes, and we find too often, lawyers in the US don't get to meet their clients with their clothes, with their sense of self. So we wanted to show this picture. But more than that, we also wanted to see, or we want to see, that 160 years don't have to pass in order for the public to pay attention to what's going on to young Indigenous bodies, young Indigenous women, as they struggle to make a life for themselves. I'm going to get on now to our work. As I said, my name is Ana Cisa Cleve Nurani. I am a social worker and midwife and the co-founder of Vida Digna. We've been working for the past 11 years in reunification processes with youth and then also separated families, young adult parents and their children as well. So our work has brought us many, many lessons, many experiences that I'd love to share with you. And I'd love to bring those voices here today. But before I do that, I want to talk about us. So Vida Digna is an Indigenous organization, which means that the decision-making power within the organization is in the hands of our board and our team that is Indigenous themselves. But more than that, we also prescribe to an Indigenous value system and an Indigenous belief system. The highlight or the central aspects of our work is food sovereignty initiatives and economic mutual aid enterprises. So I invite you to reach out to me if you're interested in these areas, and I can set you up with some people at our office in our communities that are doing this amazing work. Before I go on, I wanted to give a small overview of the cultural and linguistic outlay within the country. So you can see here, a map of Guatemala and where the different language groups are primarily located. I say primary because, as the speakers before me have said, there's been so much internal displacement because of the conflicts in the country. But more than that, I think it's important to understand the difference between one ethnic group and another. So within the country of Guatemala, we're talking about 25 ethnic groups, and 22 of these being Mayan indigenous. So we also have the Garifuna population and the Xinca population, and then 22 Mayan ethnicities. So Maya Mam, Maya Pocomchi, might have Maya Canjobal. And so it's important to understand what the different geographic regions look like, where they come from. But also more than that, it's important to know that their languages, their dress, their cultural practices, and their economic structures are totally different. We believe that it's really important to engage with clients from their cultural practice. So when I say this, sometimes it feels fluffy, or it feels, how do I engage them? And so we like to remind people that we all here have our cultural practices. So if we go back and we look at how we celebrate birth, or how we celebrate a union between people, or how do we mourn somebody, those are our practices. And so if you engage with your clients about their practices, they will come forth and talk about who they are and what they do and what they need to do to get back to their wholeness as a people. So our work is primarily with direct services, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the children and youth have a historical understanding of who they are. So we do look at colonization and this aspect and how there have been present day and historical barriers to make imposed upon indigenous peoples. For instance, we receive youth that are deported, and oftentimes when we do the first home visit, they're usually depressed, and many of the things that Dr. Canizales mentioned are true as well. There's a depression because they feel like they're personally responsible for not being able to cross to the US. So part of our structural education is teaching them that there is actual barriers and militarization of the border that needs to be taken into account. We combine this because with this multiplicity of indigenous history, of understanding where you come from, what you're about, and how big and glorious that is. So indigenous language practice, we believe, is very important, and maintaining that as well. And like I said, the cultural practices, those are the things that give us a sense of being, a sense of wholeness. And so they're really the essence of our work with young people. Many people talk about poverty, racism, socioeconomic exclusion, discrimination, like we've heard today, colonization, conflict, and abuse as being push factors. At Vida Digna, we also like to add on to this list that young people, young indigenous people, are looking to be autonomous once again. You will hear from your clients, I want to help my family. I want to make something of myself. Quiero salir adelante. I urge you to listen to them, to understand that they're interested not only in their family unity, but also they have a very strong work ethic. They're tired of being regarded as poor and in need of help. We find it very unfortunate that to acquire asylum, it is not enough to show that their country of origin has systematically denied them the right to work, and that it is criminalized their movement as indigenous peoples. Just as Dr. Canizales said, and then many of the speakers before me, it's not that there's no jobs in Central America. What's missing in Central America are the working conditions and the worker conditions. What we're referring to is a living wage, a livelihood that is not of servitude. What's worrisome to us is that when the young kids, young people, young parents get to the US, they're again in an indentured situation. They're bound by the debt that they have from crossing over, and they're forced into jobs with substandard conditions and without a voice. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything of my presentation. There you go. I went through a lot of the questions that many of you had before this, and many people asked, how do I help my Indigenous clients? And we really believe in Vida Digna that what should be looked for, what can be looked for, is empowering this access to language of power. So we believe as social agencies, as lawyers, you have this power and you can share it with people. What is this power? It's helping them find a job, helping them to learn English, and then also helping them to make the community connections that are necessary in order to leave a bad job if you're in a bad situation. Having these community connections that will connect you again to your wholeness, that will accept you for who you are and where you are. I'm going to read a little bit from something that I wrote together with my coworkers for you. It says the following. Make sure your clients remember that it is not necessary for them to cut off their beliefs to access this system, but that their beliefs are the very thing that will make them stronger. Make sure that in your work, you are not repeating what has been done for centuries, that you are not trying to take the Indian out of the Indian. I encourage you to learn about the history of oppression in the US, and at the same time, the history of resistance movements, how these two are intrinsically connected to what your client needs from you. Look into Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the Harlem Renaissance in New York. Look into the Black Panthers and their strategies, the American Indian movement and what they've been calling for. Nourish the young minds of your clients with James Baldwin, Michelle Alexander, Crazy Horse, Leonard Peltier. Finally, I would like to end with a quote from Selena Breton. She is a Kawas First Nation woman who was forced to attend an American Indian boarding school from 1986 to 1996. I believe that they thought they were teaching us. I believe that they thought that assimilating us into their way of life would help us. But they changed us into something we weren't, and there was nothing wrong with our way of life before. That's what they still don't understand. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. We are very grateful again to all of our panelists. These have been very interesting and moving and just dynamic presentations. So thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen and give me a minute. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into a time for some question and answer. And I'll raise some of the questions that have come in. Please do use the Q&A box at the bottom if you have any additional questions. We're going to just answer a few questions now. We're close to our ending time, so bear with us. I think we'll go a little bit over. We're scheduled to end at 3:45. We'll probably end at 3:50. But because of that, we'll just answer a couple questions now. And if there are outstanding questions, we will do our best to try to get some responses and email the attendees that information following the training. Be patient with us as we try to do that. So anyhow, I just wanted to let me see some of the questions that have come in. I will say it seems like some of the questions have related to publications from our speakers, and you will notice in the PDF of the bios, I did include a link to each of the panelists, either their website or the organization's website, so you can find more information about them and their publications there. So I wanted to flag that. Also, there were several questions just regarding, and I think this goes to the group, to your sources, or your references, whether there's news programs or journalists that you follow. I think people are interested in learning more. And then also if working on asylum case, it can be useful for research practices. So if you're able, I could just like to hear from the group or anyone who'd like to offer that information.
Yeah, I actually wanted to answer one of the questions that talks about how do you recommend attorneys bring up the lens of U.S. empire when you are doing affidavits? And then I can talk a little bit about my sources. Were you going to ask that?
Well, maybe let's.
Just...
Sure, I can ask that one next, Yapa. But let's go ahead and stick with this question first.
Okay, good. In terms of sources, I'm an oral historian, so a lot of the stuff I talk about is stuff that I've collected on the ground. I've been on the ground in Honduras since 2004, doing research, stuff like that. So a lot of the stuff that I do, you're just gonna have to get me on your case. Sorry, it's kidding. But I don't. I do a lot of pro bono work. I rarely get paid for the work I do. I was an immigrant myself, and was detained as a child myself, by the way. So the other sources is, and you can email me. I often work with student projects, and so I have a list of human rights reports that I use. But in terms of Central America, there's some really good sources. I love Lacey Abrego's work in general, Cecilia Mendívar. You can look up for El Salvador, right? Sarah England on the Garifuna communities. There's also a lot on Garifuna communities from anthropologists or but the really sort of critical work that I think would be useful to you, Sarah England. There's also Jennifer Goetz, Goett. In terms of queer migration, this is hard. I mean, some of us are just beginning to trace that history. I write in Spanish as well. So if you don't speak Spanish, get your team that does, I write a lot. And part of the reason why we write in Spanish is to also, this situation is a binational, transnational situation. We need to, when I'm in Honduras, people see migration very differently than here in the United States. For a very long time, when I was talking about migration in Honduras, like in the early 2000s, people saw immigrants as like the small imperialists, right? They left, like, why are they leaving? It took a long time in the caravans actually to really shift the narrative. So a lot of us write in English and Spanish, so you can look at my website there. And there's graduate students coming up who are doing great migration. There's a book called Queer Migrations edited by Edna Lubaid and Karma Chavez. I have a piece there on that. And I think that the sources are rich, the UN reports, and then also looking at the organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, but then also looking at the work of these organizations in Honduras, because there's satellite offices in Central America. That's really interesting. Obviously, Washington office in Latin America does a lot of work there as well. But looking at the work, for example, of Radio Progreso, if you look up there, you'll see I've put a lot of media. Like Radio Progreso has a research team that I actually got to stay with in 2018. And they produce this amazing research. And again, you have to read Spanish, right? Claudia Mendoza in Tegucigalpa on Twitter, she does great reporting. Sometimes it's covered by Univision. Contracorriente is a new sort of emerging millennial project that you should probably look into and follow.
These are a lot of really good ideas. Anyone else too want to chime in if there's anything you'd like to share?
I'd plug more recently Alfaro in El Salvador has an English language. They're pretty much publishing an article a day in English. One of the things that at least I've encountered is government attorneys who don't like anything that's cited in Spanish. So while a lot of the material is better or more accurate, from some of the organizations that Suyapa just mentioned, depending on what court you're in, they might not accept anything in Spanish language. So it's good to, I think what's good about Alfaro, it's usually written by people in Central America and then translated into English. So you get the best of both worlds of people who live there writing on it and then just translate it to English. So that would be the extra, in addition to WOLA, of course.
Yes, that's good to know. And of course, anything that you submit to court or USCIS has to be translated, certificate of translation. So sometimes there are capacity restrictions in-house to being able to do that. So it is good to know English language resources as well. So that's helpful. WOLA does have a wonderful project with Temple, the annotated table of contents collection of resources. CILA likes to promote that, because we think it's a great collection of information too. So fabulous. Just because of our time, I'll kind of go forward. I know, Siapa, you had a particular question you really would like to answer. So I'll just let you go ahead and do that.
Okay, yeah. Well, I was gonna say, like, I think it's about getting the right expert on your case, like that will make that critical. So all of my affidavits are like 16, 20 pages long because I have a whole section on history, right? If I'm doing El Salvador, I'm gonna talk about the war, the Civil War, I'm gonna talk about all the stuff. I know that the judge, once you have a really long report that's substantive. Also, I've seen cases where people have multiple experts. I've served with multiple experts. Like there's a case in Guatemala that here in Los Angeles where the people fled, were victims of the 1980s, but stayed and then fled later. So the trying to prove that violence is still happening now was really hard. So that was like, there were multiple of us doing that, and including people in Central America. There's a lot of NGOs in Central America now that translate the work. So Red Lesbica Catrachas does. So I've served with them many times. Also, many organizations in Guatemala, right, who translate their work. So I don't want to take forever, but I think let your experts do the hard work of talking about U.S. empire, because and the piece that I wrote in Karma Chavez's book, Queer Migration, and Etna Lube's book is, we are creating a historical record for Central Americans. And that's really a heavy burden, right? That we need to be careful of how we present these countries, right? This is why, I was telling Laura at the beginning, people would talk about homosexuals. I had to correct attorneys. You don't say homosexuals, you say lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, right? I had to correct people on Maya, Garifuna stuff, right? Like, El Corte, what does people look like? So all the stuff that everybody mentioned, right? Now we're seeing attorneys are sharper on these issues, and that's because the research is better. But so we need to create better records in that. So I'm a historian, so that's what I'm worried about. But I would say let the expert do that and give the expert the freedom to do that historical section.
Thank you. Just in interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and kind of go over some closing remarks here. I do really thank you guys again for your presentations. Everything was really wonderful. We will try to answer some of these additional questions following the training. And so we do appreciate your participation in the questions that came in. So CILA included a few resources here just in case you'd like to see some of those as well. They'll be in the slide. We do like to just mention that CILA hosts a platform where 16 organizations across the country can post pro bono opportunities, and there are a number of cases working with children and youth available. Some organizations are looking for immigration attorneys, and others will get an attorney up to speed if this is not their main area of law that they practice in. Additionally, if you're at a nonprofit and you'd like to post your cases to our platform, so there's just more visibility to attorneys that may be willing to take on a case, let us know, contact us about that as well. So we just encourage you to go to that platform and see what these cases that currently are in need of representation, because a large number of youth have to go without counsel. And we want to try to help encourage others to get involved so that those numbers go down. We want to see these youth have attorneys by their side in court. We do have a survey here for CLE credit. It's been approved again for 1.75 hours. And so we'll also put that in the chat and we'll send it via email. Please complete that if you'd like to get CLE credit or if you'd like a letter of attendance. Do give us some feedback on this training and complete that as well, our survey for feedback, because we take it to heart and we really keep it in mind as we prepare other future trainings. So thank you. There are many opportunities to stay connected to CILA by visiting our website, seeing the resources we have online. They're all free, which I think is amazing. We have a lot of written resources as well as trainings. We have working groups you can join to collaborate further with other advocates. if you're in Texas and you have a complex legal question, or you have are a social worker at an organization, you have a question about assisting youth, you can reach out to us for technical assistance on those types of issues. And you can also see what other trainings we have coming up, since again, all of them are free. You can, easily join us in the future again. So thank you again for everybody, and those who stuck around to the full duration and a little bit longer. But we hope you have a wonderful day, and be on the lookout for the recording of this training that will be posted on CILA's website as well. I know that question came up. So just so you know, we are recording that, and it will be on our website in a few weeks' time. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.